And we're going live. And we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome again to Bitch Brunch. It is my special Friday. For Not Safe for Wonks, we talk about bitch shit like gender and sex and sexuality and feminism and white feminism being bad in particular. That one's a bad one. Today we have the OG3, which of course means me, Rachel, of Not Safe for Wonks, Andrea, co-host, possibly a guest, Schrodinger's host, as usual, is here with us. And today we have our special guest, Ada Powers. Hi, Ada. Welcome.
Hello, how's it going?
Oh, it's going stellar. So
I've already started drinking, by the way.
Yes, I am drinking today as well because this week has sucked. You know, pour one out for our fallen homies. It is a tough week to be an organizer. It is always a tough week when they kill us, and today we're drinking about it and yelling about men being bad. That's not actually true. Today we are talking about gender identities. And in particular, we're kind of talking about neo-gender, but we're also just sort of generally talking about what gender is and how it's not like the same thing as sex or sexuality. Instead of what a lot of people would like you to think.
Yeah, I like this idea of neo-gender. I think that there's a question of like, well, first off, how do you define neo-gender yourself personally?
Well, I mean, so neo-gender at this point is actually almost a dated term, I think. You know, because when we think about neo-gender, we're thinking about like Zer and stuff like that, like non-conventional genders sort of as used in the academy. And that's sort of what traditionally has been classified as a neo-gender. My personal gender, I have an illustration for it. This is my gender. And it is sexy Porygon. And it is not a boy. It is not a girl. It is not
it's
actually
just sexy.
around.
That's all that matters.
Yeah, I identify as a low poly fuck Pokemon, and I think that's fine, honestly.
Right.
Like I think.
But what's in your
that kind of
pants? Polygons.
Gender. Yeah, right. What's in my pants? A Pokeball. Yeah, I mean, so you know. For the purposes of this one, I think we're kind of actually expanding even beyond neo-gender and going into like the shitpost era of gender and post-gender.
I was going to say, we're sort of post-gender around here.
But, you know, I mean, but it is kind of, right? So, not to say that gender is not a real thing, of course, but I think that there's so much flexibility in the space of gender to really like find yourself and figure out which aspects of masculinity and femininity and which aspects of yourself have nothing to do with, you know, masculinity and femininity that you identify with.
Right. Well, when I think neo-gender or post-gender or whatever, I'm not thinking about a separate category of gender. It's sort of like going back to basics, that conversation around like trans people aren't the only ones with pronouns, right? Like we're the only ones, or, you know, we are among the ones whom the pronoun you might guess could be wrong. But other people are pronouns you guess that could be right. And it doesn't really change. We don't have a fundamentally different experience of pronouns. We have a fundamentally different experience of the internal processing that has led us to choose one pronoun over the other. So I think there are a lot of people who might just identify as women out in the world who are like, yeah, sexy Porygon. Like women and men have some concept of what their gender is, that is, whether they're trans or cis or whatever, that still maps to like something in the world or themselves or whatever. So do we. We're just like being a little bit more playful with it, kind of because we have to.
Yeah, well, like because the alternative is like, you know,
that's the most important part.
Oh, go ahead.
That we can.
Yeah,
Suck it, nerd.
Well, and so I think that it's useful here to sort of distinguish between sex and gender. And this is not at any point intended to become bioessentialist or to suggest that there are not biological components of gender. And I am not saying that. I'm saying that up front. Generally speaking, when we talk about like sex characteristics, they are about like physical characteristics of a body. And when I think of gender, I think more of a social thing. You know, I think of like sort of the way that you interact with the ideas of masculine and feminine and the way you present those ideas to the people around you. And that's like kind of old school. That's like Judith Butler. And I know that you told me I should read Whipping Girl about this. So I want to bring that up as well and say, or get you to sort of tell me like what has come after that, because I haven't really explored that space.
I mean, I'm not a gender scholar in that sense. I think
Mm-hmm.
that, like, I don't know, Andrea, have you read Whipping Girl?
No, I don't
I
read.
mean,
I can't read.
I only brought it up because, well, I bring it up to people who think they might be trans women just because it's such a great, cogent description of what it's like to actually transition and what shit actually takes place. But the first half of the book, like, Julia Serrano is like an academic and theoretician and just smarty pants in that way. So the first half of the book, the second half is more like her experiences, and the first half of the book is just the overview, the lit review of gender, in the sense of like, that's when I learned about the concept of trans misogyny as being opposed to just regular misogyny, cissexism specifically, like the ways that misogyny shows up differently for trans women, the ways that sexism shows up differently along a cis trans axis. And so that's why I think it's valuable, is just to sort of get at the ways that oppression works a little bit differently, and it's less like theorizing about gender specifically. Off the top of my head, I don't really have any texts I would say go to this to figure out like the new, I think, Twitter, like that's where I go to learn about how people are experiencing gender, right? Tumblr.
Yeah.
And that's, I'll defend Tumblr to my dying day on lines of gender and mental health and disability and everything else. Like, people are out there making words for things that don't have words yet. And that's just like the social collection of folks who are figuring that out together. So I think that the internet is now where, like, for me at least, where a lot of the stuff is coming from that I find most interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can trust people to self-report on these things, Like, I think if someone tells you this is my gender, you can probably believe them, unless they're like aggressively being sarcastic at you, in which case you can probably just.
Oh, I think believe them still. If someone tells me they're an attack helicopter as their gender, I'm like, okay, what are your pronouns? Like, it really sucks. You have to get like letters from mechanics before you can get your rotor blade installed, and insurance doesn't even cover it. It sucks, right? Like, take them seriously.
No,
That's actually a good strategy because it just disarms them entirely.
Right. Like, you both think you're committing to the bit,
helicopter.
and really, you're just
It's
jacking off each other.
in.
What?
They're an attack helicopter. You can't disarm them, Andrea. It's right there in their gender. They have guns. That is part of them. You can't take it away. Free the nipple.
Are these the blue lives that I keep hearing about?
But yeah, no, I mean, I remember maybe a year ago, the first time I was ever like, maybe I'm not a cis person. I was in a DSA meeting, and I gave my pronouns as she, her, hey, you. And I'd been doing that for like a really long time. And somebody was like, hey, that's really disrespectful to trans people. And I was like, oh, my bad. And then I was like thinking about like, okay, can I just say she, her? And it made me want to die. And I was like, oh, huh. And I think that there's this sort of disconnect, I think, with a lot of people, myself included, when I was sort of figuring this out, between this idea of like category, and sort of like the third gendering of non-binary people, as it were. Sure. And I was even doing it like myself, not realizing I was doing it, right? This like sort of idea that we need to neatly fit people into categories. And I brought sex up earlier because I think even in the sort of quest people have to like attack and delegitimize like trans people and trans identities, there's this like weird sort of fallback onto, biological essentialism. And my kind of favorite thing about it is like, we're assigning based on this idea of like binary sex that doesn't even exist. And it's from that same place, wanting to categorize into like neat, discrete topics, neat, discrete like identifiers. When in reality, like every single one of these aspects, sex, gender, sexuality, they are like axes and they are their own spectrums and they intersect at the point of an individual, but they are not any of them like reliant on each other,
I think
that's
go ahead.
Well, that's the one thing that gets very frustrating is that people have this idea that like language is an immutable construct, and they go like biology. Well, you can't change biology, but we're not changing biology. We are finding words that more accurately portray that biology. The biology hasn't changed. It's always been like this. You can point back to like, you know, places in ancient Greece or whatever if you want to. Like, this has always been the case. It's always been like this. It will always be like this. The only difference is we've used separate words to describe them and how we talk about these things. But that can change. Just like how people will learn a new language to describe sitting at the dinner table, that's someone will learn a new language on how to communicate about trans people, their identities and bodies and all the like different parts and what they mean, some in like the sum of their parts and so forth. Right. And so like this whole thing where you can't change biology, which is like such a common thing, it's just that's such like they're missing the point so hard. It's
these are the same people who are often totally fine with like circumcision, or totally fine with tattoos, or totally fine with like, you know, reconstructive surgery on intersex babies who don't even have a chance to consent, right? And like all of it is about like begging this question of binary identity or categorized identity.
I'm one of God's creatures too, bitch. Like, I'm sorry that you didn't realize God had such a sick sense of humor until you looked at me. Maybe you should have figured that out before now. But yeah, I'm just working with what I was given. No trans person they know, like, often we are proud to be this way and we are happy to be this way. I think it's fucking cool. I feel like a wizard. That I can shop on both aisles of the thrift store with impunity. And it's also simultaneously not a thing I'd wish on my worst enemy, and that duality exists for us. When I think about like the rad fem, like TERF sort of, when TERFs claim feminism in a way that shows that they might actually be informed by like older feminist ideals, and then I look at like my gender comrades today, I see them as being both like understandable but opposite responses to a particular sort of oppression. Like Radfem, this magic Radfem who doesn't actually hate trans people but is like more in the second wave, we should be allies, right? Like we should be, yes, I agree. Like TERFs, the way TERF ideology shows up is not feminist, but like my understanding of people who try to relate it to feminism is saying, I am into ending gender depression. I want to dismantle the concept of gender. And if you actually want to do that, cool, tell me what that looks like. If it means that we all wind up using like neopronouns, I think you're leaning more in the gender direction, but I think what they usually mean is, I want to take away gender, and then I'm just leaning on sex essentialism, to your point earlier. It's not actually removing gender depression. You're actually attacking gender roles, which is a thing that trans people are doing too. And I think trans people have this like growth-oriented non-scarcity. I think it's a scarcity approach to say like, no, gender has caused harm, so take away gender from everyone, including people who like their gender is very fine, thank you. And I think of more of like a Cambrian explosion of gender. Like give every fucking person in the world a unique gender, and maybe some of them will relate to them similarly, but when we acknowledge that every single person has some unique gender identity, I think that also makes gender depression obsolete, because you recognize that you're breaking down these categories that have been used to oppress people before. So I think that like rad fem ideology reinforces patriarchy in the sense that it is still allowing very distinct groups of people clustered together that are easy to discriminate against.
Yeah, well, and I think it's one of its like biggest failings, as I see it, is that, you know, it really denies this lived experience of another person, you know, and I think that we see that a lot with marginalized groups, regardless of which ways, you know, a group may be marginalized. Like people who are outside of that group try to gaslight about it and say like, you know, don't have these problems aren't that bad, they're not that serious, or these problems don't even exist. And it's like, no, like these people exist. You can't just ignore them or abuse them out of existence. And I think that ultimately is a failure to understand the nature of one's own marginalization, actually.
Right. And understanding, like, this is why a lot of my activism, or what I consider activism, is like about reaching, like, I think that TERPs would have us think, like society in general would have us think that most people are cis, a few people are trans, and that's the way like the curve goes. And I think that like, why isn't it a fucking normal distribution like everything else? I think the people who are really super cis are in a relative minority. The people who are really fucking trans in a relative minority. And I think most people are just sort of like there, like they were assigned a gender at birth and it doesn't suit them poorly enough to consider transition. It's sort of like, you know, how you can be a Christian and never go to church and never really engage with your Christianity at all, but you're sort of like default Christian and that works well enough. I think a lot of people are default cis in that very similar way. And so I try to like open up the trans gatekeeping as much as possible to people who want to walk through those doors, because I think that's legitimate. That's another way that we like win. Is I'm not concerned about winning so much as I am as keeping me and my friends alive. But I think the more people realize that they actually fit under this umbrella, that they actually are served poorly by those norms, then I think that the better things get for all of us at all. So when I hear someone in a group say my pronouns are she, her, hey, you, I have that moment of like, are you doing the I don't see color of gender in a way that's disrespectful? Or is this your way, not having access to gender language or not having thought super duper hard? You're like, oh, pronouns. I'm not trans, so I'm going to keep she, her. And something's not quite right, so I'm going to like play with it a little bit. And this is what I put out into the world. That to me is a sign, like maybe you're a gender comrade and I should talk to you more. I usually do that. Like if I hear a dude be like, my pronouns or whatever, I'm like, cool. So she said, and just like toss every pronoun I can at them. Let's stress test that.
Yeah. I can say actually the only pronouns I don't like actually are neo-pronouns for myself. Like, I don't care if other people want to, like, identify themselves using Zer, and I say want to, but, like, if they identify that way authentically, like, I'm not here judging other people, but that's, like, the only one that feels wrong to me. And everything else, I'm just kind of like, sure.
Can you elaborate on that? Why does that feel that way?
Yeah, so I've thought about that one a lot, right? And I think it's an interesting one to sort of examine. Because to me, I think it came across as, like, antiquated, right? And the reason that it got to me in the first place was because it was like, yeah, but they, them. And this is because I came around, you know, at the sort of like peak of non-binary discourse, I think, which was, you know, like in the mid-teens, kind of like in early teens, where like non-binary was still like sort of a contested identity at all. And so when I saw those, I was sitting there like, yeah, but why do you get a special pronoun and I don't, you know? And it's funny how, like, even as that time has progressed, like, my sort of knee-jerk resentment of that has continued. And I think it speaks to sort of a failure of early efforts to sort of, I don't know, de-sissify, but not the good kind where you're a sissy, but the bad kind where you're cisgender.
I don't think there's anything wrong with being a sissy. I'd like to offer an alternative perspective.
Okay, I'm ready.
I think that I wouldn't call neo-pronouns, like I try to really avoid anything that makes one feel like they're sitting in a strategy chair, like, oh, they should have run that play differently. Like there was no one running the play charts. This is my attempt to talk sports. No one running the play charts for gender discourse in that way. I think that they, them, it feels right to a lot of people. It feels better for a lot of people than neo-pronouns. And I think that as a whole, I see it as an emergent adaptation to English. And basically like, all right, this is the one venue we have to hit cis people in a place where they like, not hit, but like to get them to understand that there's already a gender neutral way of referring to people in English, and let's like congregate around that. But I see that as like non-binary people sort of like having a gimme, like, all right, here, you can have this. I'll collapse all of my identities into this little box for you just so I can not get misgendered so often. So when I hear neo-pronouns, to me, I hear the difference between Z here and, Z zer. These are words that sort of like almost invoke the typical binary pronouns, and some of them do it in slightly different ways. And to me, that maps very well to the idea of like sexy Porygon as a gender. Like, are you centering femininity and masculinity? Are you centering masculinity and femininity? Or what are you tweaking and how are you tweaking it? So I think a lot of neo-pronouns were sort of created and adopted by people who wanted to still like, this is not she or her, but I'm sort of signaling or like feeling in myself what feels like my closest home to that and then twisting that home rather than moving to a totally different home altogether.
That's a
my
very
take,
good
guys.
way to think about it.
Yeah, I stand appropriately challenged, and I'll think about that one. And I mean,
Yeah, if I can throw in,
Please, Andrea, you haven't talked.
yeah, I'm getting a little, tipsy here, so I'm just kind of observing. I mostly am here to learn. But
Me too.
my trans story is like, my whole thing was I was always very uncomfortable with coming out. So I would always say, like, call me whatever. And like, so when you say that that's like kind of like an opening, or kind of like, like a way to express yourself without like exposing yourself, like in that kind of way, I do really resonate with that. I thought that was a really good way that you put things together, because I never really thought about it, and I think about this a lot because I'm a freak, but I never really thought about it in that way, and that kind of makes perfect sense with how I approached transition like 4 years ago, like, and it's like, there you go.
And it occurs to me, like, the thing that actually bothers me about pronouns for myself is actually that I don't want to be like special, right? Like, I don't want my gender to be interesting and weird, right? I want it to just sort of exist in a space and not be a big deal, because that's how it feels to me.
Right.
And so actually,
but
like,
that only speaks to the social pressure around neopronouns and not like.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's very true. And I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think I wanted to say thank you for challenging me in that way, because I hadn't really put that together for myself. And now you can go ahead and finish your thought about it.
Well, I think I have a lot of compassion for, like, I'm lucky, right? Like, I get to, have an injection that changes the way that my body is viewed by society. And so over time, I'm going to get more, like, I'm going to get gendered the way I want to get gendered more. And that gender is going to complexify as it has. Like, I consider myself a non-binary woman. But I think that, for some people, the blunt force mallets of testosterone and estrogen work well enough for them. And some people would really need like a Second Life character creator to get where they want to be. And I think that the non-medically transitioning non-binary experience from what I've seen is a lot of like holding your own, just sort of now and forever, against always having to correct people, always having to find the right space. I don't begrudge anyone for taking the route that like minimizes struggle for them.
Yeah.
And to speak to your point, Andrea, like, I don't think I would have transitioned if not for non-binary, like, third gender spaces to move into. I had I went from like he, him to like all pronouns are fine. And then like he, they, he, they, she, they, she, her. And I'm back to she, they again. And that's another reason why I like to open that door a little bit more. Like, you don't have to jump right from one binary gender to another, because I don't know that I ever would have done that if I had to wait until I felt so much like a woman that it was busting out of me. Like, I'm a queer ass dyke. I'm just not that ballerina waiting to escape.
A lot of people will ask, like, just in conversation, oh, when did you start transitioning? Like that, it's a relatively basic question, but I always feel like it's weird saying that.
Yeah,
like
it's weird too. Like, when did you start your period? Like,
I mean, and even then,
how old were you the first and the second time? Like, fuck off.
Like, I started hormones about 3 years ago, but a year before that, I started experimenting with the idea. Yeah. So I don't really, and I started like, losing weight to achieve certain goals, and started like doing body, like, recomposition with like diet and exercise. Like, so that's not necessarily medically, but it's changing my body, so there's all these points where it's like, I can't really pinpoint it on a specific thing, but I did start HRT on Friday the 13th. So I will stick with that. So
I think that speaks to the ways that biological essentialism underlies cis people's experience of trans people. And I think that speaks to just like the tragedy that the thing we're talking about here is a dissonance that only some people feel, right? Like, if you're sitting in perfectly body temperature water, you're not going to feel anything. You're not even going to be aware that you're floating in water. And for some people, that water might be a smidge too hot, too cold, scalding, freezing, whatever. And so we're talking about like, what can you see? What is in the material world that supports the existence? So I think that, for a lot of people, for me, it is like, I give them the date I started estrogen, but full time, but I don't include like the time I was fucking around with it the year prior, or the year of therapy I was going through in that time, or the first time I ever masturbated to a trans woman and felt ways about it, or like the one day of cross-dressing I did as a teen that I never thought about before or after. Like that's all part of the
Exactly.
experimentation process.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's really hard to pinpoint it. And like that's why like, you know, it's one of those questions that's kind of like a cis icebreaker. You know, they don't know much about what's going on. So like, and there's a lot of different ways you can approach it, you know, but it's like, I appreciate the kind of interest, but like at the same time, it is really hard, but it also is in a way thought provoking, and I'm able to answer in a way that kind of expands their mind a little bit. Because I usually just say like, yeah, I started hormones or whatever on this date, but I had also, you know, experimented as a kid, you know, like very young, you know, I've experimented in certain like fragments of my life were like very, you know, experimental, and then, you know, I went back to doing what I was doing because, you know, like, you know, there's a lot of different phases, and for a lot of people, they just think of it's like, you know, like a switch, like you just go through a force field, and on the other end, you're whatever now, you know, but it's not really like that. It's like a very variable situation from beginning to end.
I think that's a really good point. That makes me think about like similar to how I was talking earlier about how like everyone has pronouns. Like trans people do not like transition as we talk about it as a medical process or a social process. That is a process that is somewhat a little bit more unique to trans people. But if we just think of it as a general like becoming in dialogue with society, that's a thing that everyone who has a gendered experience, which I think everyone has some level of gendered experience just by virtue of being assigned a gender and having to react to that for the rest of their lives in some way, like everyone is becoming. And I think that could be sort of a pedagogical crowbar to sort of insert this thinking around like, I am constantly in relation to my gender. I am constantly becoming. I am constantly transitioning in that I am constantly reacting to society's idea of gender and checking against my own introspection. And those are not patented tools. Like every single person who might be hearing this or otherwise has the ability to do that. And if you arrive back at exactly where you came into that process with, cool, you still deconstructed it. I can see the little cracks in the vase. Like you broke it apart, you picked it up, and you glued it all back together exactly the same as it was before. That is still a deconstructed
another
process.
Thing that people are very critical of is like, oh, what about these 15-year-old like trans trenders that are trying it out?
That
like
makes
my
me
response
so
is, yeah, let them try. Like that's the whole idea, is if they don't like it, they don't like it. You can't like force people to simultaneously pick a side and then at the same time say that you can't, you know, experiment, because like, what if people don't like the side that you can't enforce a decision, and that and so like I love the idea of like when people say like kids are being trendy, it's like that's awesome. The idea that like this is something that people that are that young are latching onto and saying, hey, I'm going to give this a shot, even if it's for a week, even if they're doing it for like cringy satirical purposes, whatever. It still expands that horizon that says, you know what? Cool. Do whatever you want, be yourself, and that should be empowered.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I also think, agree wholeheartedly. I also think we should make more space for silliness with gender anyway. Like people, and this includes like not all trans people by any means, and definitely not all cis people by any means, but just like there are people among us who take gender very, very seriously, you know? And I want to push back on that too when I talk about like my own gender, when I like think about gender in its own right. Like I feel like all of these things are really, you know, like you were saying, Ada, a dialogue, right? Like with society, with ourselves, with sort of these platonic ideals of masculine and feminism that are themselves dialogues with society and within society, right? Like, and there's a sort of inherent absurdity to that. You know, that like we exist at all as like thinking sacks of meat that are capable of even giving a shit about gender in the first place is kind of funny to me. So gender's like sexy Porygon, right? Like, and to be fair, it is literally the trans colors, y'all. It's literally sexy Porygon is the trans colors. Like,
right down to the eyes, like the eyes being the whites and everything. I love it.
Just putting that out there. But like, I also think that like, you know, that sort of play with gender is a good thing, like an inherently good thing.
Yeah, I don't think that it's
an act of deconstruction, you know, in the form of play is ultimately a really like healthy, constructive thing. And so like, you know, we talk about like a 15-year-old
I think
cross-dressing or whatever, like hell yeah, like even if it was as a joke, like fuck it, you spent a day in a dress, good for you. Like you had that experience, and it's a good thing to explore. Like same with sexuality, like, you know, have a gay experience like once, like just do it. Like try it. If you don't like it, it's fine. You know, you don't have to do it ever again. You don't even have to do it the first time, but like you should try it.
Or at least think about why you would not want to try it and what sort of like, if you would do it except for the things that would happen to you if you did, well, there's some information for you.
Right.
Yeah, I certainly don't think gender is somehow an exempt category from the overall sublime, ridiculous nihilism of life as a whole. Like, I think that life is fucking hilarious. Being a human being is fucking hilarious. Obviously, I also think life is sacred, and our ability to be here existing in the simulation that we're in is a huge, tremendous gift. And I'm not going to like, that irreverence is not taking a dump on, I take it seriously too. And I also think it's hilarious. And I'm not about to confiscate anyone's genders or say that gender is like a plaything only. It's serious to a lot of people. It's serious to me. And it's also funny that it's serious. And it's serious that it's funny.
Yeah. I think
there's like the intrinsic kind of like humor involved with like the first time you go to the other section of the store or like whatever, like, and that's just inherently funny. Like the idea of like you're in an area that you feel is right, but at the same time is so foreign. Like it's just funny
for the first time, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of like, it's just hilarious. And
you're very awkward and self-conscious and having a really good time, but also aware of how awkward and self-conscious you are.
Exactly. I think anytime you could take an experience and make it funny or sad, depending on what the soundtrack would be, you're on something special. Like and me furtively looking around the dresses, if you had like the Austin Powers, like da-da-da-da-da, and I'm like looking around dresses, that would be kind of funny. And if it's like soulful violin music, well, yeah, that was in me too at the time I was doing that.
Yeah, yeah.
And that just goes back to the idea that there's like, you cannot pinpoint any one experience just to one word. Like in like especially like a binary system, like, you know, like let's like even look at movies. Like there are movies that are horror, but then also movies that are kind of funny, and some are that are both. And you know, like you like it's not like a problem to use upwards of like 5 different genres for a movie. How come it's so like, you know, taboo to do that for gender? You know, it's like you got to really think about things. It's like this, that, everything else on top of it is perfectly valid.
Yeah. Well, and I think whenever you encounter that kind of really, really fiercely enforced categorization of anything, you should ask yourself, like, who in power benefits from this? You know, anytime anybody tries to say you have to be one thing specifically, I'm like, who's making money off of me being one thing specifically? Like,
I get into this all the time when I'm sorting things, and I'm like, does the count? Should I not have the count? And
yes, and I do think I want to bring in the nuance of like, sometimes it's a very easy process, and sometimes it's a follow the money sort of thing. Like, I'll be the first to say it. Trans people engage in gatekeeping all the time. Like, looking Buck Angel, there are like some of the people calling people transgenders on Tumblr are like just binary trans people who transitioned at the same time. And I would not say that it is a punch up only in the sense that people who are still figuring out their identity are a bit more vulnerable than people who haven't figured it out yet. But everyone is still fighting for crumbs of respectability from like society as a whole, normative society in that.
It's super easy for trans people to kind of like step on each other to try to like get to the top because in a way that like they need to be validated in that specific way. Like, you know, you look at like the kind of like cringy trans like conservative YouTubers out there that are like, I have to like be this like kind of way in order to have these people view me as a real woman or whatever. Right. And it's just bizarre, but like it helps them kind of validate themselves, so you can't necessarily criticize that. But it's like every other part of like the idea that like it's like kind of in a way punching horizontally up until the point where like they profit off of it, and then it's obviously then like that gives them the motive to punch down and continue to punch down so that others can't take up their space that they're occupying.
Right. Yeah. I mean, assimilationism is always a worthy topic to bring into that. And I think that like LGBTQIA plus is not really a genuine coalition, sort of like how, I mean, you know, not to get too controversial, but like leftists are always going to be the ragtag rebels against a homogenous hegemony, because that's like what it's all about. And I think similarly with queer folks, like all the people under the queer umbrella are really just all the people who are trying to survive under straight people. Like that society put us in that category together. We don't always naturally make good friends, and sometimes our needs are genuinely not aligned in relation to how we want to relate to the power structure as a whole. And it's hard but necessary in the same direction. And it's okay to talk about those differences. I also hate when people like, oh, you're being divisive by speaking about what you need. And we have, but that's also respectability politics, right? Like who benefits from me shoving my concerns aside so we can like present a united front?
Yeah. Well, and it's like, we're not queer people, generally speaking. We are not, like you said, we're not united under one banner where we all actually have this like sort of intrinsic sameness to ourselves, right? We're just like the losers table. Like we're that lunch table that everybody sits at because nobody else at the table is going to be like, no, you can't sit here. And that's like basically what the queer community at its best, I think, is like that sort of like, fuck it, yeah, come along, you know? And it can be like this really awesome inclusive space. And also it can be, like you were saying, you know, this really weird crabs in a bucket mentality where people are like trying to assimilate by shoving somebody else under their feet. And, you know, I personally think like, you know, the first Pride was a fucking riot. Like we started this by being, you know, counterculture, and like I say I was not even born yet, but like the queer movement started, you know, as being this really radical thing and this really like intentionally incendiary thing. And I think, you know, in the last 15 years, we've had, you know, this really large push towards like heteronormativity and towards respectability and towards assimilation from like sort of the elder queers that has in turn like made it in some ways even harder for younger people who are queer, you know, to like be like poly, for example, or to be like pansexual, or to be trans, or to, you know, be these things that defy the sort of normal lifestyles that those elder queers, you know, adopted and built huge platforms on. And I'm not saying that like there were not like wild and crazy queers, you know, in the last 30 years or whatever. I'm saying more that like we have been pigeonholed and shoved into like this box of like normativity on what is the kind of okay queer to be. Like,
well, it's also a trauma response, right? Like what I don't think of any behavior that I would describe to an elder queer as being because they're an elder queer. I think that time makes you helps you succeed better, and then succeeding better helps you align with power structures better. And then that's just like the cycle of trauma that is present in everything from our own upbringings to like the fucking like academic pursuit of, well, I was abused by my PI, so like clearly I have to like, it wouldn't be fair for me to just stop the cycle now. I'm also going to start like giving grad students my bit work too. Like we all have this really hard choice to make of when is it okay that other people are suffering less than we did, and that doesn't. We have to confront the trauma that we suffered more than we should have. Not that we made it and other people should suffer that exact same amount. And that's where the alignment of power, I think, really affects things.
Yeah.
Like one of my partners transitioned 10 years ago, and she didn't like go stealth and drop off the planet. She mentors and talks to and is in the trans community all the time. Like, consider her a trans elder in many ways. And also she's awesome. Like, you know, it has nothing to do with age or length of transition, but being distant from your time of greatest struggle is a thing that affects all of us.
Yeah. Well, and I don't mean to like say it's because they're elders. If it came across that way, I apologize.
Sure.
I more mean to say that, like the pattern as I see it with like the Ellens and the Pete Buttigiegs and like Pete Buttigieg's whatever. With them, the like good queers who are like generally cis and married and have kids and have respectable jobs and work in the academy and that kind of stuff. Like that sort of assimilated group that by way of assimilating, became normalized, became accepted, and sort of became, like poster queers, right? And for them in particular, I have a lot of resentment.
Sure. I want to circle back for a second and put you on the spot a little.
Oh, no.
The streams this, and I think that the reasons why you did are possibly really interesting and educational. Why, put back up Sexy Porygon. Tell me why Sexy Porygon is a gender to you. Can you explain to me what about it appeals to you with as much nuance as possible?
Yes.
I'm enjoying this grilling.
This is going to be a fun exercise. Yeah. Sexy Porygon. All right, so a couple of things are going on here that I identify. One, big butt, frankly, just big butt as such. This Pokemon here, as it were, is really doing some very exaggerated types of femininity. But also it's a Porygon. It's not a woman. It's not intended to be a sex object, right? And it's sort of made of all these sharp angles and edges that have been really forcibly pushed into these sexy gendered roles. And you and I were talking about this recently-ish, where I was talking about my experience of womanhood as something that has happened to me, and something that continues to happen to me because of how I look, because of the body that I have, because of the way I, present, right? And how I have this sort of love-hate with it almost, because it's very useful to me because I'm a lot smarter than a lot of the men who are harassing me sexually, and I can use that to my advantage. It's also really exhausting and traumatic because sometimes the men are bigger and just do sex things to my body whether I want them to or not, right? And so there's this dual sort of power trauma balance there. And the words you used to describe it that I thought were really illuminating were that I wasn't really describing a feminine identity so much as a negative space in the shape of a woman. And that resonated with me, And so when I say Sexy Porygon, it's it is about the Porygon being something that has been made very feminine and sexual out of something that's sort of not, that is not a sexy lady, but has been forced into the shape of a sexy lady by some pervert, and that I think
emphasis on pervert, given the probable person that drew that image. There's a lot going on there, possibilities wise.
I myself am a proud pervert. I have no problems with perversion.
I think perversion is healthy. It's as long as it's in moderation,
My incognito browsing history is a series of progressively more desperate attempts to find novelty in porn. And I'm not here to throw shade on anybody who is the same way as me and therefore a pervert. But what I am here to say is that I identify with being the poor Pokemon that some asshole decided needed to get fucked and look like a lady while that was happening,
God bless.
Is that a nuanced enough answer?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. I really like how you're relating it to your experience as a gendered creature in society. When I look at it, too, I also see, I've talked about, sliders and levers before regarding my own transition, and this may sound a little binarist. I know that non-binary is not a space between masculine and feminine, but I do see things as sort of as my body gets more complex, I have an internal gender balance. It happens to be, just dyke of center. And so for me, that is a lot of alignment with femininity. It's a lot of alignment away from masculinity. It's also an alignment away from traditional femininity. And it's an alignment towards a sort of healthier masculinity. And I think when you have all those pushes and pulls going on, when I first started transitioning, my body was not really giving any feminine points to the equation. And so I had to make that up with makeup. I put on lipstick for this. I don't even fucking know why. I always think I need to, and then I wind up hating it while I'm looking at myself. I almost left to take it off. I am really comfortable just being andro dykey kind of boyish creature right now. And that is so different for me than I was 2 years ago. Earlier in my transition, I was leaning harder into and feeling femininity a lot more. And I think as my body has gotten a little more feminine, now I get to play with it more. I get to like, I couldn't have this haircut as a cis guy and get like gendered she. It would just never happen. And I get gendered she less often now, but I have enough other things going for me and it can accentuate parts of my body where I get that treatment by society. And so now I have more like masculine points to play with. And so I think a lot about like how masculinity can be centered in the context of femininity or vice versa, or how you can get to androgyny through like finding the mean and splitting the difference in a lot of gendered expression, or going like, in both directions simultaneously. I'm going to have a lot of feminine and a lot of masculine. So when I see sexy Porygon, I think like, I look at those sharp angles and those feel relevant to me. Or the overall positioning, the shape is what we might recognize as a feminine shape. But each one of those angles could probably cut you. Like, it is a very non-curvy, but also curvy. And I think that could speak to a lot of people. And I think you could imagine similarly, the inverse of that, right? Like, what would a very like balloon-shaped boy look like, right? Like, I'm sure a lot of people feel that way.
I would love to see Drifloom in that style.
My answer is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Sure.
I have not seen that. People have recommended it. Is it good?
God, hold on. I'll be right back. Y'all talk amongst yourselves. I'm going to get a picture of the Pillarmen to illustrate JoJo's Adventure.
I'm thinking of now like sexy Baymax is a gender.
Hell yes.
Big Max?
Baymax from Big Hero 6. 6.
I think my youngsterness is showing. I don't know any of this.
I think.
How old are you, Andrea?
I'm 24.
You're not that young.
I think that came out only a few years ago.
Young?
I think that we're revealing the ways that I'm more of a kid than you are. But it was a Disney movie.
I'm stuck in like this era of like 93 to like 2002, and I will never deviate from that media-wise. So anything that I experienced as a kid, staying with me forever.
Baymax is a medical droid in like a 3D animated cartoon that looks sort of like futuristic Michelin Man. Is like basically a expanded what's the thing in cars that explodes when you almost crash? Airbag, just like big, full of air, and is very round, and is always like, "Do you need help? Can I get you anything? You appear to be in distress." And so I'm thinking of like that as a masculine gender, right? Like, we can go all over. We could do this whole day.
There's a lot there.
I mean, I'd probably fuck sexy Baymax. Like, all right, so these are the Pillarmen, and if you turn balloons into men, it would be this.
Oh my
God!
What?
If you were to turn balloons into sexy men, it would be this specifically.
I mean,
are there balloons? There's some balloons down there I can see in the middle there. But...
I think they need to be rounder. If they were rounder, then I guess this is just revealing the fact that like humans in general are sort of like balloony shaped if you have muscles.
They do kind of have that vibe though. Like, you know, when you see like balloon animals and they'll do like ribs with like a bunch of different balloons, it's like that for their abs.
Okay, so if those men that you showed me, if you pushed on them and they were not filled with muscle but with like marshmallow fluff, I think that would be nicer.
Like, what if the Pillarmen but squishy? I'm here for it. So we've got a few minutes left here. Before we wrap it up, what are some of your favorite post-gender genders? Do you have any?
I don't have an answer.
Huh?
I do not have an answer.
I've related to femininity lately in the sense of opening the fridge door and your fridge is fully stocked and then you call out like, "There's nothing to eat."
Yeah,
kind of how
right.
It feels.
That's me every single day.
Like, I'm doing everything right, and like that like reward just isn't there. I'm a fan of the like.
I feel like
so I think we're. Go ahead.
Mine would be very similar to that, but it's like the fourth time you do it in a row, expecting the food in the fridge to be different.
I think this also drifts into like neurodivergence chat and like how robot is like a thing that some people relate to, or non-human animals. Like, I'm not a furry, but I feel like vaguely but strongly cat aligned. And sometimes I also feel like a robot who is learning how to love, but has gotten very good at it. And so when I describe my gender, I'm often also describing like how I relate to the world in general. And it is as this like highly intuitive robot who is like somehow found like the neurotypical rule book and like speed read it and is like, okay, trying my best.
Yeah.
And so I think when you know, swarm of bees, right? Or like a pair of pants floating above the ground with no one inside of them. Those are all genders, and they say something about gender. They also say something about like affiliation with humanity or relation to even the concept of having a body.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something to that, yeah. And sort of like almost transhumanist aspect of it, of like, you know, gender, relating to gender as like an affect almost.
Yeah, I think that's also a way that a lot of like cis people start to do gender alignments when they realize like I could talk about drag in lots of ways, and it's not all negative. I think drag is a very interesting cultural phenomenon, but I think the exposure to the concept of drag, of like cosplaying as a thing that other people actually are, in some cases, I think help people realize that they're also cosplaying as themselves. Like if you're assigned female at birth, you may also come across the realization you've been cosplaying as a woman when you get dressed. Like there are ways I think that you can be performing a gender really, really well and still just sort of be doing it by like learned rote.
Yeah.
Because it's just like what your parents like, you know, raise you as and how they treat you and like the clothing you have and all these like rituals that you were taught. Like you might not necessarily identify with them, but you just do them because that's what you were told to do.
Yeah.
It's never occurred to you not to.
And it's not like, you know, that, you know, extra as like clothing or whatever. Can be like behaviors that are integral to how your brain processes certain things, like how you would react to certain things. And when you really break down a lot of those kind of reactions, you realize, you know what? Actually, that's not how I will react to that. I disagree with myself previously. And that's how like a lot of change in maturing happens in general, is people realize that there's a lot of these barriers and boundaries that were applied to them when they were a kid that are no longer there now that they've reached a certain point in their life, whether it be like, you know, a specific age that lets you do a specific activity in society, or just something you grew out of, you know?
And then tying it back to capitalism, because I know this popular with this crowd, I think we also have this idea that like you should do what you're good at. Like if you have acquired some skills in a career type field, then that should just be your career, and it's almost like a waste to the world to choose to do anything else, because why should you prioritize your own happiness? And same thinking can trip a lot of people up in the sense of like, I learned how to do a certain type of gender really well, so I should just keep doing this. Otherwise, I have to go back to being a noob and being unskilled, being a novice. Like giving into that like growth-oriented mindset around failure is really hard and scary for people, and the consequences we make are really big. Like a way that I relate to my femininity, and another metaphorical way is like a diploma painstakingly drawn in crayon. Like I cared enough to put it together. I spent a while in like a boot camp of learning femininity, and it's like, here are my credentials. Are you satisfied now? But like, I'm no more a woman because I learned how to do those things. It just helps me exist a little bit easier in the world in certain ways.
Yeah. Well, and I think that sort of brings about a very central truth. You know, early on I said the gender is like a social thing, right? And gender is like it's a shorthand almost for things people should expect from us, or ways we want people to see us, you know, and we communicate those with gender.
Gender's a role, but it's also the person who decided to become an actor instead of a mechanic, right? Like, I've decided to play the part of femininity, and that does not make femininity any more or less real. But I'm also the person who decided that femininity was the part that I wanted to play, that woman was the role I wanted to live. And that's where I think the intrinsic experience of a gender is like, this is what I want. This is the social construct that I wish to put my skill points towards, as opposed to all the other social constructs I could be doing that with.
Yeah. And I think in that way, gender is very similar to like any other sort of identity type calling, you know. It is a very complicated constellation of, you know, physical and visual and verbal markers that we are using to try and quickly communicate some essential part of ourselves. And, you know, I think the challenge is not in necessarily figuring out what your gender is, but really like understanding who you are and the ways who you are reflects these expectations of gender.
Right, which, like, no surprise, people who are queer often deconstruct other aspects of their identity, or they come at it from a different angle, and the tiniest little thing, completely unrelated to serious matters of identity, can start unraveling that sweater. Gender is just one part of who people are, and we're always trying to figure out who we are, or we should be.
The one thing that is not an acceptable gender, though, and I will die on this hill, you can't be a gamer. It's the one thing you can't do.
Come on, man.
No gamers
Let me
allowed.
have fun.
No gamers. Nope. Gamers are bad. You can't be one of those. That's not a it's the only thing. The one thing. Actually,
Can I
there
be
are
a gamer girl?
Huh?
Can my gender be gamer girl or fake
No.
gamer girl?
Gamer girls aren't real. Because in order to be a gamer, and this is according to gamers, of course, you have to be a man.
That
Gamer
is
girl-
actually true.
Yes, I
We
know.
didn't make the rules.
I have not beaten Bloodborne and not figured out what gamer men are like. We'll put it that way. And I am speaking from experience when I say I am not a gamer for sure. But I will also say, you know, there are two genders. They are gamer and trans, and one of them is bad.
How could you talk about trans people that way?
Oh no.
What the fuck? I see how this is. Our relationship is over. We'll never see.
What's more important, gaming
with
or
gamers.
your identity?
We're done.
I agree with you, but I also feel like opposing you out of sassy principle.
So, you know, that's fine. That's acceptable. Yeah. In the spirit of the show, Bitch Brunch, our Friday gender sextacular, where we yell about bitch shit and only people who self-identify as a bitch are allowed to join. So whatever that means to you, thanks for being here, bitches. If you love me dearly and would like to get more of me, you can pay me $90 an hour to video chat you one-on-one. Or you can follow us on Twitter at Rachel Khan. You can also give us money at patreon.com/notsafe. It is going towards helping me get a fancy fuck chair that will allow me to lay in different positions and still record depending on which part of my body is broken on a given day, which would be great for me. It's also like $7,000 and very expensive. So consider becoming a patron and helping us out. Andrea, thanks for being here with us as always.
There's probably some gamer chairs that would be good.
Yeah, you know, probably, but it's complicated. I'll show you later.
What did you ask me? I forgot.
Do you have anything you want to like send people towards for the day?
Oh, I'm doing a stream on my own later. You can show up. I'm getting drunk. I started drinking here. That's why I'm a little tipsy. I'm going to get drunk. So if you want to watch, feel free. YouTube, Cyberdy1531. Hit me up. Thank you. Also, there's probably more important things you could watch as well.
You know, there are, I'm sure, many important things to watch, and one of them is your stream where you get drunk. Ada, what would you like to direct people towards?
If my content is relevant to you, you'll probably run across it sooner or later. You can type Ada Powers into Twitter, and I'll show up. Yeah, happy to be here. I'm just lucky to be in the company of you two fine, fabulous bitches. Andrea, it was nice talking with you, and Rachel, I'll see you back in the banter mines.
Absolutely, where we all live and struggle on a regular basis. Also, if you would just love to get more Not Safe content, right now, about half of the Not Safe cast is currently doing a telethon. It's called Project 50 Telethon. It is to benefit Los Vecinos de Buford Highway, which is really just about trying to keep people in their homes who are vulnerable in Atlanta. I strongly recommend you go check it out. You can find that on the Metro Atlanta DSA pages. That is Metro ETL DSA on Twitter and Metro Atlanta DSA on Facebook and probably a couple of other places. You can also find this telethon on vecinosvh.org. That is vecinosvh.org. I will put that up here real quick so y'all can see it under banners. And I strongly recommend you go check it out. throw some money their way. This is an incredibly good cause.
Oh shit! I just am really glad I didn't look at the comments until just now.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
don't worry about
there's
that.
some terrible people. So vecinosvh.org, that is where you will be able to find the telethon that is currently going on. It's pretty exciting. It is a good cause. I recommend you go check it out. I will probably be popping in over there later on tonight. So yeah. Otherwise, thanks for being with us. This has been Bitch Brunch. We'll be back on Monday with more not safe content. Bye everybody.
Bye.